Uh, Welcome to ODI, all of you, Overseas Development Institute. Today's event is Adapting Rwanda's Economy in a Changing Climate. I'm Ari Huhtala, the Deputy CEO for the Climate and Development Knowledge Network, CDKN, and based here at ODI, which is one of the 5 alliance members of CDKN. We at CDKN provide capacity development and knowledge exchange function for the what is called a Future Climate for Africa program, on which we're shining the spotlight today in this event. FCFA, the Future Climate for Africa, aims to generate fundamentally new climate science focused on Africa, and to ensure this science has a positive impact on human development. It's our job in CDKN to support applied research under FCFA that helps new science to be integrated into decision making and to make the findings widely accessible and debated and tested by stakeholders. So that's what today's talk is about. You'll hear the results from some important applied research that Paul Watkis has been carrying out with FCFA support to make Rwanda's tea and coffee sectors more resilient to climate change, and in partnership with the government of Rwanda. CDKN has organized this event to share the work with a broader audience in the hope that this leading edge work can offer helpful guidance to other agriculture-dependent economies. We also commissioned and we're very heavily involved in the production of a documentary film about the Rwandan government's work to tell this important story. And I believe we'll be seeing the 3-minute version of it later today, but you can find the long version and supporting resources on our website, cdkn.org. So Rwanda's story about managing current climate risk and adapting its tea and coffee sector management to future climate risks is of international significance because it goes beyond small-scale pilot project in adaptation and resilience and seeks to embed climate resilience at the macroeconomic scale. So the measures you'll be hearing about today do not look at climate change in isolation, but critically they take the government of Rwanda's medium-term development plans as their starting point and look at how these economy-wide objectives can be future climate-proofed in the future. And what's more, the government of Rwanda has a plan to actually finance the incremental costs of future-proofing the tea and coffee sectors through their country's climate and environment fund, FONERWA, which will be described by our colleagues in Kigali, which incidentally is the best capitalized climate fund in Africa. So we are very, very proud of having been associated in its startup phase. Such an integrated worldview and action plan is fundamental to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. In this, we wish Rwanda every success in delivering its far-sighted plans, and we hope that others can learn from the Rwanda experience. And this event will be chaired by Nicola Ranger from DFID, who is a leading force of getting the FCFA started and going. And I pass on the floor now to Nicola.
Thank you, Ari, and thank you all for coming today, and thank you to everyone online as well. And so I'm just going to say a few words before we move on to the interesting bit of the day. I really am glad that we're highlighting this work because this is such an innovative piece of work that's really tailored to a country that is really a leader in this area in Rwanda, but also such an economically important sector as well, tea and coffee in Rwanda. And this is such a good example of how we can, in practice, really integrate climate into real development planning. And it's such a crucial issue for DFID right now. I don't know, can you put my slides up, someone? As we're moving towards increasing our funding for climate finance by about 50% or by 50%. So it's so crucial for DFID, but also for international climate finance as well. Now, I find Paul's work particularly important, firstly because he looks at the implications of long-term climate as well as climate today. If you look at most climate resilience work, it's actually only really considering the short-term risks of climate. But Paul really does look forwards and say, okay, what are the implications of those long-term risks for what we're doing now, which I think is really unique. And I think the other important thing about what Paul does is he brings together both the world-leading science, but also economics and social science, and addresses real problems. And I know it sounds obvious that we do that, but actually I think very few people do it well. And I think Paul and also Emily as well do that well. And this approach is embodied in our Future Climate for Africa programme, which brings together both world-leading natural science, I won't go into the details, to improve understanding and prediction of climate, but at the same time brings in the strong social science and the economics as well, to provide new knowledge, tools, methods that really try to integrate climate, long-term and near-term climate, into real development programs. And one of the important ways it does this, which also I think is quite unique, is it focuses on real problems. So it works with African decision makers on real problems and provides real solutions. And it does that through a number of pilots. And this map here shows where the first phase pilots are operating. So without further ado, I will introduce our speakers for today. So firstly, Paul Watkis, who is Director of Paul Watkis Associates and Senior Research Associate at the University of Oxford and Global Climate Adaptation Partnership. And Emily Wilkinson, who is a research fellow at ODI with 14 years experience working in the area of governance of disaster and climate risks, working across the world. And then I'm also delighted that we're joined by two colleagues from Rwanda. So firstly, Sarah Love, who is the Climate Change and Low Carbon Development Advisor from DFID, so sort of my counterpart in DFID Rwanda. And finally, but definitely not least, certainly most importantly, is Alex Mulisa, who's Coordinator for Environment and Climate Change at the National Environment and Climate Change Fund, which we all know as FONERWA in Rwanda. So thank you all for joining us. I'm really excited about this, and I'll pass on to Paul to get into the details.
Okay. Do we have a video first? Is that the... Okay.
Oh, sorry, I was meant to say a couple of other things, which I've forgotten. So you can you can tweet on hashtag #AdaptRwanda. You are joining us online, which is wonderful, and you can send questions to us at any time, and I'll receive them on this nifty little iPad here and be able to pass those on to the speakers. So now you can start, Paul.
Okay, thank you very much, Nicola. I'm not quite sure how this bit's going to work, but I assume that what we have been doing is producing a small film just to as a sort of appetizer or a taster of some of the work that we're doing. And we're going to play that now, I think. And there is a longer version available, which is more of a little documentary. It's only 12 minutes. It's not 2.5 hours to get through. So I would highly recommend you have a look at that. And we'll go into a presentation after that, just to give it a little bit more detail. But okay.
Rwanda is one of the few countries in Africa that have a clear strategy that define a vision, long-term vision of the kind of economy the country is aspiring to and how it's planning to tackle the impacts of climate change going forward.
For Rwanda, agriculture is a vital industry that employs 80% of the country's population and generates 1/3 of its GDP. The tea and coffee sectors have been earmarked as critical growth areas. However, tea and coffee are very sensitive to the climate, and the sector faces risks from future climate change. While this presents a potentially worrying future, there are actions that can be taken to address these climate risks.
First, we advanced low-regret adaptation with a focus on addressing current climate variability, trying to encourage options that are good for the climate today, but also help build resilience for the future. And a good example of that is the coffee shade trees that we're proposing.
These early initiatives are relatively simple and provide quick wins, but there are also longer-term problems that need solutions.
Secondly, we're looking at near-term decisions that have a long lifetime and will be exposed to climate change in the future. And a good example there is the expansion of the tea areas and the need to expand those into areas which will be suitable for production in the future under climate change as well as today. And the final area is to take account of the large future risks that might be emerging and to start with monitoring, research and information so that we can learn and actually prepare and improve our future decision making.
So it's good to start thinking now strategically so that the investment made today are resilient within the changing climate.
Rwanda is also the first African country to set up its own national climate fund, FONERWA. FONERWA is financing the Tea and Coffee Project, funding the introduction of coffee shade trees, advancing climate knowledge for tea expansion, and enhancing monitoring and information. Rwanda's climate is already changing, but fortunately so are its policies. The country is starting to take future climate change into account today, and as this case study on tea and coffee shows, is putting strategies in place to manage the risks and create opportunities.
My hope is that we do as much as we can and show others that, you can change the future by acting right today. And that's what we are trying to do.
Say the end title sequence is almost as long as the entire video. Right, that works surprisingly well. What we would like to do now is just for me to say a few words about the case study. So as you can see, I spend most of my time these days standing in tea and coffee fields, so it's actually quite nice to be in an office environment for once. And I do want to stress this is a Rwandan-led initiative with a team based in Rwanda, with me providing a little bit of technical assistance support. And it's very much just because of location that I'm here presenting today. And this is something that's very much a collaborative and a joint effort. So what do I want to say? Well, I think the starting point is to say this is just an example of the way that we're starting to think and program adaptation, and to highlight that that's interesting from not the perspective just of tea and coffee, but really from the changing way that we're doing things compared to maybe the dominant approach over the last couple of decades. And I suppose the key issue is that we're moving and at a really interesting transition point in going from a way that we have primarily thought about this in the past with a very science-led and what might be the classic impacts of vulnerability and adaptation domain, very much based from an environmental and social perspective, working primarily with, say, the Department of Environment or the Ministry of Environment, to something which really is closer to more core development programming, and also recognizing that's moving away and having to do different things. So what we've really found is that people that we meet and talk about adaptation to, particularly people who are wanting to implement as the finance scales up, are asking for different things. They're asking for something that's more applied and practical. They really want us to focus down. They don't want a long list of 1,000 options to deal with every conceivable risk. They want to know where they should focus. And they also want to know about this issue of uncertainty, which is a big challenge. I do apologize. ODI decided my slides were a bit boring, so they've come in and put lots of pictures in. So I kind of, which is good. I mean, really good, but just it just takes a little bit of time to adjust. So decision makers increasingly say, well, what is this problem of uncertainty and how do we deal with it? So if you go to them and say, well, if there's 20 centimeters of sea level rise, do this. If there's a meter, do that. And they say, yeah, but how much sea level rise are we going to get? And when I say, I don't know, they say that's really not very much use. I don't think anyone's formally called me an idiot, but they've certainly implied it. And so we need to think about how to program good adaptation. And I think over the last decade, and particularly more recently, there is a really nice body of literature that is emerging which says, well, how do you do that and move into practice? And I want to factor in these 7 points because they're really what we've tried to do. And this is really just a case study on trying to apply what the literature is telling us to do and see what works. And not everything has worked, and we've failed in some areas and we've succeeded in others. So critically, I think the first point, and this is something that, Nicola, I know, is very close to her own heart, and she's been pushing this as a really strong issue in her own academic work, is the move towards a policy-first or a decision-first approach. So actually trying to think about this as a problem in relation to what you're going to do, as opposed to adaptation being at the end of a long technical assessment and a set of risks. And that doesn't sound like that much of a change, but it fundamentally transforms the way that we think about things. So we embed everything within the sector development objectives that we're working in. You know, in this case, we're in agriculture, so we're thinking about agricultural growth objectives. They're our primary thing to deliver, and all we're trying to do is add on the climate change bit on top of that. So it's a really different way of thinking. Also focusing on the short term, people want to know, what do I program in my next investment, my 5-year plan, not what do we need to worry about in 2050. This issue of moving from environment to the other sectors, and that's a big change because you're working in areas which might not really think about climate change, or certainly don't think about it in the same way that the Ministry of Environment does. And something we'll come back to a few times is this change. We used to call it adaptive management. I think the fashion these days is to call it iterative climate risk management, which isn't quite so catchy, but it is very, very much a theme that came out in the IPCC's Working Group 2 summary last year. And then finally, just to highlight the role of economics. As we scale up, we're going to have to do more economics, which is good for people like me, I guess. And I think the reality of the sorts of funding that Nicola is talking about really necessitates doing the economics and finance properly. You know, you can't get away with a one-page submission with a few costs on it anymore. You've really got to do this in a proper way. And I think, linking back to your point, thinking about this in terms of national growth perspectives and macroeconomics. So it's a very interesting issue. There are some problems there as well, though. You know, economics doesn't like adaptation, if I can be as crude as that, because it doesn't like investing today for benefits that happen in the future or may not even happen at all. And so, you know, the discounting issue is an issue, and we have to think a little bit more cleverly about how we program. Okay, now you know you're not going to be able to read this, so I'll have to try and do it off the top of my head. We've struggled for a long time about how to make this manageable. And one of the things we did a long time ago in the first UK climate risk assessment, which we have also applied in these types of concepts, is just to say, here's a series of steps that actually try and take those points into account. Starting with the problem, thinking about entry points, and I'll come on to that in a moment, and assessing what's important before you get to the climate science. So there's a whole upstream bit that we haven't traditionally done that we then need to do. And then in that sort of climate and options analysis, shifting from the way that we used to do things to these iterative frameworks, and then on the back end of it, a whole series of extra activities that come with the climate finance. Moving into financing, moving into programming, looking at implementation modalities right from classic development economics through to behaviour. And then I think something that we are all very aware of is evaluation and learning. So there's no point doing this if we're not picking up things and changing things as we go forward, particularly with this uncertainty issue. So that last point is almost as important as all the others, although it tends to be typically ignored to some extent. So we heard about these in the video, and I'll maybe talk about them a little bit more. Maybe it is just worth saying this. We've struggled for a long time to take some of the academic principles and lots of the papers that people like Nicola and Sam and myself have developed and put them into practice. So if I'm brutally honest, they're quite a hard sell. Going to someone and saying I can predict the future is quite easy. Going and telling them they need an 18-point plan on how to recognise uncertainty in a complex way with some real options analysis tends to fail. And we've got it down to things which we think sort of work, which is just to say there are 3 building blocks that you can put together that broadly get these concepts together. And as Nicola has said, move us beyond just thinking about the current. So the first one is really to say, focusing on low regret actions today that are building resilience for the future, and that can include capacity building as well as low regret options, because those give us an economic win today. There's something that makes sense that provide an economic justification while also, helping to adapt in both current and future terms. The second one is this long lifetime, and we're going to hear an example about a tea plantation, but I think the other example that's very classic there is infrastructure. And related to that, spatial planning and land use planning. Anything that's got a long lock-in that will be exposed to climate change in the future. But I think the key difference is there is a lot of the early literature just said, well, over-design it. You can design the problem away with some engineers who'll tell you how to climate-proof. And from an economic rationale, that's madness. You really shouldn't be spending huge amounts of money for something that may or may not happen. And so we've had this literature that's come through on flexibility and robustness that talk about how you can do those long-term things in a way that makes economic sense, but also allows us to evolve and change. And the final one's really just this preparing for the long term. You know, there are some very scary outcomes out there, but you don't have to do everything today, and there is a process of learning and evaluation to put things in place now that will actually provide the information to improve decisions. Now, from an economic perspective, we might talk about the value of information and option values, but it's really just about some early planning to do something sensible that actually can feed into that learning process and actually go forward. So, let's get on to Rwanda. Why Rwanda? And this is my role as, ambassador for the Rwanda Tourist Board. It's a fantastic country. I mean, it's really beautiful. I'd highly recommend you go there on holiday. The people are lovely. And it also has, luckily as well, one of the most advanced institutional climate landscapes in Africa. I mean, I genuinely think it's leading the way. And as some examples, and Alex will talk a little bit about these, I'm sure, in a moment, it's already raised climate change as an issue in its 5-year development planning process and the vision. It's already got a green growth and climate resilience strategy. Alex will talk about the fund. And it's also trying to mainstream into the sectors. So it's really taken that mainstreaming principle and gone for it. And I think that's really positive, although when you get to the practicalities, we're doing a lot of work here with the Ministry of Agriculture. It's only still at the process of translating that into reality. So, it's very well to have the sort of ambition, but we're now at the point where we're trying to do that. And I think the one thing that we have learnt is, particularly going into agriculture and looking at this, is you've got to find an entry point to hang this adaptation upon. It's no good just going in with small programmatic activities. You've got to look at something that actually aligns to the sector development planning. But it's more than just the strategy. You've got to find the thing and the investment plans that can be used and designed, and where you can get your climate-smart activities to be embedded within. And in this particular case, it's the agriculture sector investment plan. So that's a 3 to 4 year planning document with budget line allocations right through to indicators that allows us to look at the activities that the government is planning with backed-up finance, and then see what we can do, where the risks are and where the opportunities are for adaptation. So that's the entry point that we've used. And going beyond that, we looked at that and said, that's quite large. Why don't we just pick a little example first, just to get some experience? And we picked tea and coffee. And we picked tea and coffee because it's interesting. And it's very interesting because, as the video says, agriculture is very important. Tea and coffee are essentially all of agricultural exports, so they're a huge component of exports by value. And also, probably like many countries, they're there in the national plans as a key source of future expansion because of the role of increasing exports. So it links through very nicely to national development objectives. And at the same time, it's doing some things which are really quite ambitious. So one of the things that Rwanda plans to do is double the amount of land under tea, which is, irrespective of, that policy issue, that's something that's going to make some very big changes that have a very long lifetime. And so the first thing that we've been doing is trying to use this iterative framework and pick out the building blocks. What are we concerned about in terms of climate change? And so the first thing we have started with is thinking, well, what are the problems today? And we have some very nice information from a colleague who's been doing some very nice effectively econometric analysis about how tea varies with climate variability. And we've got some very nice production data that uses satellite data and daily data. A little bit more of a challenge for coffee, but we're going to work on that, which effectively start to bring out this picture about how important the climate is today in terms of economic value and production and a whole range of issues. So we have some good information as the starting point. In bad years, yields go down by 20%. And that's one element. But the other thing that we found is that there's this very strong relationship with pests and diseases. So you see this very strong elevation profile related to temperature. And at the bottom, you get these economic thresholds that get passed in bad years where you lose very large amounts of production. So you've got this very strong relationship with climate in two domains that actually have a very significant effect on the sector. As we've mentioned, there's this tea expansion and there is also coffee expansion. And I think what's interesting there was this was really the first time where we'd sat down and said, is there anything that's not infrastructure that's going to be around for a long time and we need to think about? And actually, the more you do think about it, the more examples you find. And this was a very nice example where, if you plant a new tea plantation, it's 8 years before the things are mature enough to even start harvesting, and it's 15 years before you get your payback, and then it's another 30 years that the plantation will be there producing. So you've got something that almost is like infrastructure, but sort of in a very dispersed and small-scale approach, but with the same sort of implicit capital investment profile. So it's really interesting. And one of the things was we looked at the areas where Rwanda is expanding into or plans to expand, and that's all based on the current climate. What that means is they've looked at the climate over the last 30 or 40 years and said, this is where it's suitable to grow tea at the moment, let's grow tea there now in the future. And this is where it's really interesting, is because at the same time they want to grow more tea, they want to move to higher quality tea. And higher quality tea is grown at higher areas because, and I'm going to sound a bit of a nerd here, the tea tips grow slightly more slowly, and so you get a better quality and a better taste. So if you plant your production areas at areas that are too low, you're basically competing with the Kenyan market for sort of mass production, and you don't really get very good price. So we found huge price differentials, an order of magnitude price differential between the bottom of the what you would give to, I'm going to say builder's tea, but effectively builder's tea, and sort of thing that you might enjoy in a fancy restaurant in New York or whatever it might be. So there's some really important issues there, linked to the markets, which mean that if you're going to go for that high value market, you've got to think very carefully. And then finally, we started to look at some of the big issues and the challenges, and without being too despondent about climate modelling, we can find almost nothing that is of very much use for us in Rwanda, just because the climate models aren't disaggregated enough, and just because the range of uncertainty is so large. We're effectively guessing. We may be guessing with a little bit of style, but we are effectively guessing. So we've got a bounded range that we know about, and we need to start thinking about what we can think and plan for. So we came up with these building blocks, and to save a bit of time, I won't go through them in a lot of detail. But we essentially have a set of early building blocks that link very much to this discussion around climate-smart agriculture. You'll all know the sorts of things that we're talking about, but coupled with a lot of capacity building. So we're investing in institutional strengthening as well as on-the-ground adaptation. And we think one of the really nice bits of literature that I've seen starting to come out is that you get a more effective solution if you put the two together, which kind of makes sense. But that combination of soft and hard is really, really interesting. It's a little bit more challenging for the economics, but I think it's a real priority. The second one is actually looking at these areas of expansion and trying to say, can we use climate information to help inform, particularly on the outgrower schemes, where we might want to prioritise? And I'll come back with a little bit of economics in a moment on that. And the final one is just to start the process of thinking about the future. So there's very little pest monitoring today. So if we don't even know where the pests are today, how are we going to track how they're changing? How are we going to track the economic threshold levels, which are linked to quite often climate parameters? And if we're tracking those, then we can start to see how the risks are changing and get appropriate responses in time. And many of these in-time development objectives for the future take a long time. If you're trying to look at resistant varieties for coffee, you've got a 20-year planning horizon from early research through to scale-up. So it's not something that you can just delay and hope you can fix in the future. And then I suppose finally on this side, we've been trying to make this as concrete as possible using both economic and financial analysis, because we are in an area that necessitates that we think about this properly. We're making hard investment decisions with people's money, and other people's money at least. And we need to be very aware of making sure the economics and the finances make sense. And I think the interesting thing that has come through on that is we've actually had to apply different economic principles for our different building blocks. And that was something maybe we hadn't realised at the start that we have learned. So in many cases, on the low regret adaptation options, we can just pitch up with a cost-benefit analysis. So that's fine. That's pretty standard stuff. We do have to look at a lot of externalities to make things really be appropriate in terms of the best or the optimal solutions. But that's all manageable. When it comes to the longer term, we've had to work a little bit harder. And I think one of the issues that we have recognised is that there really are some quite nice techniques that you could apply, for example, in the UK, which are taken from the financial markets primarily and are strategies for risk, hedging, portfolios, all these sorts of things. But they're really quite challenging to apply in the context of Rwanda. So we've been trying to think about light touch approaches. We've started to do some rule-based criteria and some hedging strategies. But there are some things there that I think are quite nice, where you can take some of the concepts and try and apply. And the final one is around, strictly speaking, the value of information and quasi-option values and trying to get some economic analysis. But what we're trying to do there is a lot of common sense, really. We're just trying to say there's some things that are worth investing in today because of the option values that they give us in the future. And we can start again to use some sort of decision trees and some thinking just to highlight what those might be and where we might need to invest earlier or later. So we've been doing that, and we've been doing that within a model that's built, value chain models for tea and coffee, and allows us to sort of shop the model with climate change. So we can have a little look at that and do some cost-benefit analysis on options. And two quick things to finish, really. I always say that my life used to be easy because I used to pitch up, do a risk assessment and come up with a few adaptation options, and then go. And now my life is a world of pain, I have to be honest. And part of the pain is this. It's about implementation. And I think one great lesson that I've learnt from the mainstreaming on this is moving from a classic, maybe a small-scale project where you have a government implementing entity, an executing entity doing something, say, in the Ministry of Environment, with a very small and discrete project and an NGO that we use for the on-the-ground implementation, to a mainstreaming example is just a different scale. This is, classic development, but it's a really different initiative, and getting our value chain lined up with all the different players really has been an enormous amount of, I suppose, thinking and work to bring everybody on board. So, we're going right from the government through to some implementation partners, whether that's cooperatives or NGOs working with large numbers of smallholders. You've got quite a complex chain there of people to bring with you. And that's taken us a little bit longer than I think we anticipated. And I think also we've got into the gritty reality of, behaviour and development economics, of thinking about how do we get the legacy issues, how do we sustain this, should we be trying to work outside of government with, either capacity building or the value chain or the private sector to try and get the enabling environment in place to do this. And I'll be very honest, a lot of that adaptation literature doesn't even think about this. So actually you can get the most perfect adaptation option in the world, but if you can't implement it with the right, addressing the right barriers, then you're nowhere. And that's been a humbling experience to realise how complicated that can be. And likewise, I do quite a little bit of review work on the costs and benefits of adaptation, and as with much of my life, we cheat. We just sort of look at the technical costs, and we maybe do a little bit on the capacity building costs. But there's a whole range of issues that go downstream: capacity building, training, management, project management, reporting, monitoring, that have an implicit cost associated with them. And the opportunity transaction and implementation costs are really quite significant. And one lesson is we haven't necessarily factored those in. We certainly haven't factored them into the sort of numbers you'll see bandied around in Paris declarations. We certainly don't often think about them and realise quite how much they are. And the more complex your project, the more that those costs rise up the agenda, and the bigger proportion they are. And this is something that DFID have to enjoy. But quite often, if you're working with management organisations to implement, there are a whole set of additional costs that come there that we need to think about and we need to plan for. And just to highlight the finance, Alex will talk about FONERWA. As we scale up, and GCF is talking about very serious projects. I think Alex may well allude to the fact that Rwanda has already its accreditation with the Green Climate Fund and is in the process of applying for a major GCF project. You're talking about some pretty large-scale finance, and you're going to have some pretty large-scale technical, economic and financial analysis to backstop that, as you would for any other project in that area. So it's a real recognition that we need to get that and expand it. I think one observation I would make is that there are lots of different funding opportunities out there, and everyone wants a slightly different form. And one of the things that I have learned is that it's quite useful to think about your resource mobilisation at the start and who might fund it, because of the implicit things that they will be asking for as you go through the process of your application documents and your analysis. And so a little bit of pre-planning can save a lot of pain later on. So I want to conclude with just a few points. We've learnt a huge amount from this pilot, and I think one of the things that's come through is it has been a really useful way to think about mainstreaming, to move from single standalone programming with a simple Ministry of Environment or Department of Environment modality to something that's more akin to a sector development planning exercise. So it's been really useful, and I think the steps that we've added at the start have really helped that. And we'd have got completely lost if we'd have just gone in and not thought about those. I think the iterative frameworks really have been useful in trying to think about these building blocks. Trying to think what you do now in terms of obviously recognising there's a priority to address the adaptation deficit today, but also trying to capture a few long-term things, because I think those long-term things are really important, particularly when you talk about additionality. One of the questions that we continually get asked is this any different to development? And if you only do the stuff today, the answer is not really. If you also include that portfolio of the longer and the medium and longer term stuff, then definitely yes. And it may be that the funding is orientated so that there's a bigger block on the short term, but what we really strongly advise is the portfolio. You have to go with all of it, and it's through the consideration of all three building blocks that you get your additionality. And that's been good to sort of find out as well. As I've said, a lot more pain these days as you move from a simple single project, particularly with a simple individual action on the ground, to a more complex program. That's just the reality, and it's going to be the way that we go. I think very importantly, this issue about the economic and financial analysis, bringing in and providing the justification and the support for what we're planning, because we're having to justify this to Ministry of Agriculture, but also write the CBAs that then go to the Ministry of Finance, and they have a slightly sterner view about what should be done than perhaps the Ministry of Environment. So it's a slightly different world, and we have to have economics and finance to really build the case. Something that I want to highlight, and I will also pop this up because I think something that Sarah Love might be able to talk about. One of the things that I think this project has done that I haven't seen anywhere else, and I think is really great, is it's sort of thought about the technical assistance that might be needed to actually encourage and mainstream the climate change alongside the main sector budget support or the sector programming. So what DFID have done rather cleverly is introduce a small technical assistance project to mainstream not just climate but a series of other interventions into the Ministry of Agriculture, which provides a technical backstopping line to help doing the mainstreaming and the scaling up. So it's a really nice way to say, we recognise that this may be a Rwandan-led initiative, but we also recognise that it will be useful to provide some support there, so that as that goes forward, there's some call down and some assistance to make sure that some of the things which might be a little bit more challenging, or there's some opportunity to really climate smart, are given the assistance to make sure that happens. And one of the things we have found is that as you move from the Ministry of Environment, where the climate change expertise tends to be centred, you're going into ministries where there's really very little climate change capacity. Certainly no one in Ministry of Agriculture knows a huge amount about statistically downscaled climate models, as an example. So there's a challenge as you push out mainstreaming that you come up to technical assistance barriers. And I think one of the clever things here is to have that sort of push and that pull linked together so that you can go forward. And we're just in the process of going into implementation. We're just finishing our design phase. We should hopefully start in July. And I think this is a really nice example that we will use in terms of helping to make FONERWA a little bit more strategic, but also in scaling up some of the ministry sector plans we're trying to build up into a bigger climate smart agriculture proposal to actually start doing climate smarting in sector level development planning at scale. And the great thing about that is you can then start leveraging. So you can start leveraging on underlying sector budgets, and that gets you a lot further than a small amount of individual programming money. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. I think you've inadvertently come up with a new great tagline for the Met Office, guessing with style.
Yeah.
And shown us the need to hug an economist more in our work. And we've quite cleverly eaten into all of the time I had to ask you hard questions.
Yeah, that was a plan.
But if I might ask you one hard one, and this is not just focused on Rwanda, but your experience more generally, do you think that as a community we're doing enough to build in those long-term risks into our climate work today? And you've got less than a minute to answer.
Yeah, well, I can do it in 5 seconds. No. Although I think I think it is starting to change slowly, but I think there isn't enough done on there. And maybe one point just to highlight that there is a danger of integration or mainstreaming, as we call it, is the more that you mainstream, the more you go out from where that expertise and knowledge is about those long-term issues, and the more you get back into the world of the short term. And so I think one of the challenges going forward is that as we mainstream, we need to ensure those longer-term issues aren't lost along the way.
Thank you. So I'd now like to bring in Mr. Alex Melissa. Hello. You may need to unmute yourselves. Hello, thank you again for joining us today.
Now?
Yes, we can. Thank you. So can I ask for a little bit of context on, how important is the tea and coffee sector to Rwanda, and what role do they play in your longer term development plans?
I think we decide to skip those and go to these questions.
Hang on.
Hang on a second.
Okay, thank you.
Alex, I think we might actually, we decided we'd rather you talked about FONERWA than tea and coffee.
Okay.
So we might just
sorry,
give you a
the questions
slightly
have
different
changed.
set of...
Okay.
See, not only did they change my slides, they changed your questions.
Yeah, they did.
That helps certainly.
Okay, so apologies for that. Could you tell us more about FONERWA, please, and how it works, and how importantly is this research helping in your work on FONERWA?
Thank you so much. Glad to be talking about FONERWA rather than tea and coffee, which I could have tried, but yes. FONERWA is a national environment and climate change fund. It's embedded, and this brings out the linkages with what Paul was talking about mainstreaming. It's deliberately embedded in the green growth and climate resilience strategy. And that was very deliberate in terms of ensuring that climate financing is mainstreamed across different sectors, including agriculture, energy, the critical sectors that impact on climate change. I won't talk about the history of it. That would take much longer. But it is important to note that in its design, it has a long-term perspective, but it started as a demand-led fund, where we put out call for proposals and invite applicants with the best ideas that are supported. Of course, those ideas must be relevant to environment and climate change from a development perspective, poverty reduction, being inclusive, all those nice words. One of the critical success factors for FONERWA, among others, is its governance mechanism. It has a three-level governance mechanism, essentially two, because we have the board, which is called Fund Management Committee, that then has a technical arm, the Fund Technical Committee. It's usually sometimes looked at as a level, sometimes not, but rather a supportive technical arm to facilitate decision making for the Fund Management Committee. And then there is the day-to-day fund management team. The reason I say that is critical is any fund of the kind of climate finance must have mechanisms in place that assure either donors or even the applicants to be able to understand their measures for transparency, accountability. But what is really has been defining for FONERWA has been its ability to attract technically competent and high quality projects. That has been the history. As Paul mentioned, I think in passing, right now we have learned lessons and we are realizing that there is a need to transition to a more strategic level. But I suppose I leave that for the next question you might ask, perhaps. So demand-led fund, which is national in scope, seeking to attract a high level and high quality projects that significantly impact development in a sustainable way.
Thank you. And could you say any words about this particular study from Future Climate for Africa with Paul and how that's feeding into FONERWA and informing your strategic priorities going forwards?
Yes. Maybe before I do that, I bring out something that is really defining in terms of the funding itself. Right now, it has had some very healthy funding up to this point, a significant of which is provided by UK's DFID to the tune of 22.5 million pounds. But what has also set FONERWA apart is the thought that went into the management support, which DFID supported for the first 3 years, in addition to the capitalization that I talked about. To date, we have been able to attract some other interest from the German's KfW, their development bank, the African Development Bank, and we have been able to engage the different financing facilities. Now, that has certainly enabled us to think more strategically in terms of how we can support proposals, including this one for mainstreaming, that would require even significant financing. We struggled in the initial stages in terms of attracting mainstreaming projects, but much more recently, with the consistent focus on the need to mainstream, we were fortunate that sectors have responded, including the Minagri, the Ministry of Agriculture's proposal on tea and coffee. And what is interesting, I mean, I was part of the board discussions in terms of making a funding decision. And one of the key things for which the project was seen as attractive is the piloting context. A lot of times mainstreaming has seemed much more theoretical when they talk about it, and this is something that even came through when they were discussing what is this project going to do. So the practicality of piloting key crops, including tea and coffee, were part of the critical reasons why this project got funding. The other aspect was the partnership. The fact that there is already funding which facilitates bringing financing at scale for something like this was also quite appealing in terms of ensuring that funds are leveraged to bring even this pilot to scope and scale. So those are some of the defining aspects that were brought to bear in making the funding decision. Going forward, there is a whole lot of hope in terms of ensuring that what we have struggled with in terms of mainstreaming in the different sectors might actually be realized. Just to kind of give you a bit of a short history about the mainstreaming, we worked on mainstreaming environment and poverty, We were able to even influence budget call circulars in the Ministry of Finance. And then we were able to bring some teams, what we called the word has gone, but we brought some young university students, placed them in different sectors. It's so to speak like interns, but on a much more advanced level in terms of influencing sectors to even adopt budgeting and planning in these sectors. Quite an interesting approach, which we thought would bear fruit. But there are two things that seemed to undermine this. The practical nature, they were still at the theoretical level, which this project of tea and coffee through piloting goes beyond that theoretical perspective. Then there is also the capacity that Paul was talking about. Technical capacity is very important in underpinning the success of mainstreaming. And we are hoping that the technical capacity that is going to be delivered through the project management unit is perhaps going to make a much bigger difference than our earlier experiences, which though were reputed to have succeeded, have not really led to effective mainstreaming.
Thank you. And just briefly, what's your experience of using climate information in FONERWA? Is it something that you're using outside of this pilot project? And can you give any examples of that? What sort of challenges you come across?
To be honest, that is one of the weaknesses we have seen across the board. Climate information. There is climate information that has been generated at the national level. We have data ranging all the way from 1971, talking about the onset of rains, talking about the number of days within a season. So there is some decent but yet to be improved climate information. So we have struggled on that front. And I would be the first to admit that we have even struggled in attracting proposals that clearly integrate and rely on that solid base of climate information. What we have done recently and what we actually look forward to, even in this tea and coffee experiment, is to generate significant data. In addition, we also have, as a fund, deliberately attracted funding to the Meteo Rwanda in collaboration and partnership with the Meteo UK to be able to enhance and improve the climate information that then will be able to guide project design and the choice of projects that we implement. We also have deliberately in our windows for funding put management information systems, and we are hoping that from this mainstreaming work as well as the Meteo work, we are going to improve the climate information that then will be able to allow us to target financing in ways that not only address current but even future climate impacts.
Thank you. And I hope we can continue to work with you on Future Climate for Africa as well, and our other programs like WISER. We look forward to that. So can I come on to Sarah then? Can you say a few words about what DFID Rwanda is doing to help build resilience in Rwanda?
Yes, thanks, Nicola. We've been supporting FONERWA over the last sort of 3 or 4 years now. Before that, we have a strong track record of engagement with the government on climate change issues. I think starting off with a piece of work that Paul was involved with in 2009 on the economics of climate change in Rwanda, so a sort of mini Stern review looking at impacts in Rwanda, and I think that particularly caught the attention of the Ministry of Finance in Rwanda and kind of helped that political buy-in, that sort of high-level interest in climate change that's really sort of sparked this whole process, which then went on to the green growth and climate resilience strategy that Paul mentioned, and subsequently FONERWA. So DFID have supported the design of FONERWA. We're also supporting some technical assistance to the fund management team. As Alex mentioned, it's a government-led, a government-managed fund, but they have had some technical assistance in helping to set up the fund that DFID's supported. And as Alex mentioned, we've also put £22.5 million in the fund, which is nearly fully committed, which is great news to a wide range of really excellent projects. And we're currently in the process of our next business planning phase and deciding what our future support on climate change in Rwanda might look like.
And how are you thinking about integrating climate across the development portfolio at DFID Rwanda? In particular, what are the challenges you come across?
Yeah, okay. I mean, so FONERWA is our sort of standalone climate change programme within the office here. But we have a number of other programmes where we've tried and succeeded, I hope, in several cases to integrate climate change within those programmes. Paul spoke about our agriculture programme, which is a big programme of support that the office provides to the government's agriculture strategy. We provide some funding to the strategy itself, but also, as Paul mentioned, there's a technical assistance facility where a core component of that technical assistance is expected to be providing support on climate change mainstreaming. So agriculture is a sort of obvious candidate, I suppose, for mainstreaming. There are other programmes too, particularly our social protection programme, which is looking at building resilience and particularly supporting people who are particularly exposed to climate risks, and there may be scope for expanding on that and mainstreaming climate further in future. But I think also interestingly there are some other programmes that aren't sort of immediate candidates for climate mainstreaming, but where we think there's sort of existing existing efforts and also more potential in future. So things like our access to finance programme, where we're looking at kind of weather insurance and also support to particular value chains. I know the Access to Finance programme is looking at tea and coffee, so there are lots of opportunities to bring in the work that Paul's been doing to make sure that those risks and opportunities are properly reflected in that programme. Similarly, our trade facilitation programme, Trademark East Africa, I think there are lots of opportunities there, particularly around the infrastructure elements of the programme, to make sure that there's proper risk screening done around those in terms of sort of location of infrastructure as well as design and implementation. So I think Paul has fed into some of the work and the analysis that we've done on risks and opportunities across the programme, and we're certainly keen to do more and to make sure that across the board on our governance programmes, on our social sector programmes and our economic growth programmes, that climate change mainstreaming features quite heavily in those.
Thank you. And just a final one, so Rwanda is really seen as a front runner in this area. Can you give sort of one or two top tips from your experience for others in DFID, but also other donors and governments?
Two top tips, okay. I mean, I think in Rwanda, political buy-in has been absolutely critical. I mean, this is led from the top, so right up to the President's office. This is an issue that has visibility and is something that the government is keen on pursuing, which has certainly been helpful. I mentioned the Economics of Climate Change study that really sort of sparked interest on the Ministry of Finance side, but they've been very actively involved in FONERWA. They sit on the board of the fund and were very involved in the design of the fund and take an interest in what's happening, as Alex, I'm sure, can attest to. So I think having that interest from the Ministry of Finance, and this is not just an environmental issue, which I think it can be in other contexts. In Rwanda, it's definitely kind of part of the budget and other discussions. I think sort of coordination across ministries has been a challenge and remains a challenge, but I think is also really critical. And that's not just sort of coordination at ministerial level, but also with sort of local government, because a lot of the projects that have come to FONERWA are being implemented at district level, local government level. And so one of the more interesting projects that came early on to the fund was a proposal from the Ministry of Local Government to try and mainstream climate change through district development plans. And so it's almost a way of kind of getting the fund to pay for capacity building at district level, which is a really interesting approach, and certainly looks to be doing a good job and delivering some early results. And then I just want to sort of pick up on a point that Paul made early on about sort of thinking about designing a fund so that you're attracting kind of international sources of climate finance. I mean, I think this was definitely on the minds of the government when they were designing FONERWA, and the problem was that the GCF hadn't been designed yet. So in some respects, Rwanda was so far ahead that that's proved a challenge. So Rwanda was always trying to second guess exactly what the GCF would be after in terms of being able to slot themselves in and attract finance from that source. But I think as Paul or Alex mentioned, Rwanda's one of the first national governments to have been accredited to the GCF, and looks like it may be one of the first to be able to access the fund. So that's really great news. So yeah, I sort of agree that thinking of the bigger picture and the other broader sources of funding, not just kind of bilateral funding, is really critical to the ongoing success and sustainability of the fund.
Thank you, and I hope you'll hang around for some questions from the audience as well in a few minutes. So before we open out to everyone else, I'd just like to bring in Emily. Thanks for joining us. So what do you think are the real challenges of doing this in practice? Not just looking at Rwanda now, but your experience more broadly, and particularly when you get down from the ministerial level that we've been talking here down to the local level.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. We've been looking here at a really successful, I think, experience and really innovative experience of doing this kind of mainstreaming in a national ministry where you've got political buy-in has been spoken about today, and I think most importantly where you've got already a sort of development or sectoral policy in place that's already got funding and there's kind of commitment behind it. So then the sort of adaptation, mainstreaming or integration is the added layer, and we've got a fund in place to support that. So it's sort of, you can see where here, as Paul was saying, it's adaptation really is more than just good development, because we're actually integrating additional information, and there's a kind of an extra incremental or additional cost to this, and that I'm really pleased that there's some good examples now of that working well, and we've gone beyond the sort of rhetoric around the need to mainstream adaptation into development. I think when you get down to the local level, you've got a whole new set of challenges. Because you haven't necessarily got the development plans in place already, you haven't necessarily got sort of funding to support those plans. There might be lots of good ideas about what to do in terms of development. So then when you think about the kind of additional challenge of doing the sort of the adaptation part of it and bringing in the climate information and making those investments climate smart, that's sort of going to be even more challenging for local governments. And I think there's a risk that there is an imbalance as well in terms of funding for supporting locally led interventions as well. I mean, one example that I think is really interesting from the BRACED programme, which DFID is also supporting, building resilience to climate extremes and disasters, is one of the projects being led on by the Near East Foundation, which is quite innovative, where they're trying to set up decentralised climate funds at the level of local government and supporting them with technical assistance and sort of financial management capacity. But those funds could be as big as £500,000, and this is in Mali and Senegal. That's a lot of money. That's significantly larger than the amount of money that these local governments will get transferred through regular channels for development projects. So I think there's a real kind of tension there. They're going to really dwarf regular development funding, and then you can see obviously the traction of using climate funds for development projects, just the development element of it, without sort of adding on the adaptation layer. So I think some real challenges there when you get sort of down to local government and you haven't necessarily got the kind of the capacity to just do the development projects in the first place.
Thank you. I'm going to open out to questions now, so we've only got 25 minutes left. A quick hand up at the front.